You know, most of the sickness that we experience is simply a part of living in a sin cursed world. At times, however, it is something more. As believers, God may choose to discipline us through sickness. For example, all right, stay with me. Paul warned the church at Corinth that God could judge them with physical illness if they failed to examine themselves for sin and took the Lord's Supper unworthy. Also, James instructed the sick to confess their sins that they might be healed. I mean, certainly, all right, all sickness is not the result of sin, but some is. In Psalm 38, David was suffering from a crippling illness that he recognized as God's discipline for his sin. As he revealed in this psalm, his suffering extended beyond the grueling physical pain that racked his body. He was suffering spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and socially as well. I mean, his entire being was sick. Now, sin has a cruel way of devastating every part of us, our souls and spirits, as well as our bodies. At the beginning of this heart wrenching psalm, David described it as a psalm of remembrance. From his sickbed, Israel's ailing king cried out to God to look down upon him and act to help him in his suffering. And Psalm 38 was used by the congregation of Israel in the confession of sin on the Day of Atonement, reminding David and the Jews of the painful consequences of sin. Now, we would be wise to turn to it when we are considering some temptation, all right? By remembering David's excruciating suffering, we might be strengthened to resist temptation and thereby spare ourselves God's painful discipline. Verse 1, discerning that his sickness was God's disciplining for his sin, David entreated the Lord not to discipline him in anger. So he poured out his aching heart to the Lord, describing in graphic detail his excruciating suffering. And by speaking so freely of his pain, David was not complaining or expressing anger towards the Lord. In his pitiable words, we should read the tone of a broken man, all right, not a bitter one. God's rod of discipline was accomplishing its purpose. David was ready to confess his sin and be reconciled to the Lord. That is why he begged God for mercy. Now, in verse 2, God's judgment is sometimes described in the Old Testament as the shooting of his arrows. David confessed that God's darts had struck their target, piercing through his flesh to his very soul. The deepest pain he felt was not from the disease that possessed his body, it was the gnawing spiritual torment of being out of fellowship with God. See, the Lord's disciplining hand had fallen with full force upon David, completely crushing him beneath its unbearable weight. And in verse 3, God's discipline had totally wrecked David's health. There was no health in his body, not one part of him that was completely whole. See, by referring to his bones, David expressed that his agony had penetrated past his flesh into the deepest parts of his being. Soundness is the familiar Hebrew word shalom, which is commonly translated as peace. Well, inner turmoil compounded his physical pain, all right? David's soul and spirit were suffering as intensely as his body, all because of his sin. Verse 4, David described himself as a man drowning in a sea of guilt. Now, overwhelmed me depicts the deep waters of a flood, all right, in which a person cannot survive. The guilt of his sin was a burden that David could not bear, and he crumbled beneath its crushing weight. Now, verse 5, David could not see the foolishness of his sinful choices while indulging in the pleasures of sin. But it became starkly clear to him as he gazed upon the festering sores that blotched his now diseased body, how he wished that he could go back and relive the day that he fell into sin's choking clutch. Verse 6. David's physical pain and overwhelming guilt plunged him into the depths of depression. Bowed down and brought very low describes his mental state. All right. Now, the Hebrew word for bowed down means crooked or distorted, and it is the root word of guilt. It is used to describe severe emotional distress and also a person with a disturbed mind. Now, David used a play on words that connected his mental condition to his sin. His iniquities, perverted, twisted actions had distorted his thinking and outlook on life. Brought low speaks of the humiliation and shame that David's sin had brought upon him. Now, the king's sin had taken him to his knees, all right, cruelly stripping away his self esteem and painfully disappointing his family and his nation. So, consumed with grief, he spent his days mourning for all that he had lost and the damage that his sin had caused. Verse 7. Returning to his physical condition, David confessed that his sin had completely broken his health. His back burned with inflammation. I mean, searing, all right, literally means to burn with fire. Now, David again stated that his entire body was affected by his sickness. Not one part of him was whole. Verse 8. As a result, he was utterly exhausted, crushed, and he was in constant agony. Well, brothers and sisters, as we reflect here on David's description of his condition, we need to keep three truths in mind. All right, first, not all sickness is caused by sin. Some is actually caused by Satan, as in Job and Paul's lives. Now, some sickness is the result of poor lifestyle choices, such as eating an unhealthy diet and neglecting exercise. Much sickness is the natural product of our mortal, corruptible bodies. That was one. Now, second, God's disciplining of his children, all right, true believers, is correction, not punishment. God's wrath for our sin was absorbed by Jesus Christ on the cross. God disciplines us as a loving father, all right, not as an angry God. His discipline is actually for our good. And third, sin has painful, unavoidable consequences. Like an out of control fire, all right, it tears through our lives, leaving only pain and destruction in its trail. When we are tempted, Satan whispers that we will not be caught, that we can successfully get by sinning. I mean, just as he did to Eve. Well, David's troubling testimony should jerk us back to the truth, all right? May it strike us with a holy fear of sin and its devastating consequences.